There is a peculiar pattern that appears again and again in the lives of thinking men and women. They work toward something they claim to desire. They speak of their intentions with conviction. They arrange the conditions necessary for success. And then, at the threshold of achievement, something within them interferes. A forgotten appointment, a sudden illness, an inexplicable impulse to withdraw. The very goal they pursued becomes unreachable, not by external failure, but by their own hand. And when they look back upon the wreckage of their efforts, they find themselves asking, "Why did I do that? What possessed me?" This is not mere bad luck. It is not coincidence. It is the return of something that was never truly gone. It is the revolt of the suppressed. When we speak of self-sabotage, we are speaking of a symptom. The sabotage itself is not the illness. It is the signal that something beneath consciousness has been denied its voice. The psyche does not tolerate repression indefinitely. What is pushed down does not disappear. It waits. It gathers force. And when it returns, it does so not as a quiet whisper, but as a disruption that cannot be ignored. To understand why suppressed emotions return as self-sabotage, we must first understand what suppression truly is. It is not the same as conscious discipline or the postponement of gratification. Suppression is the refusal to acknowledge what is real within us. It is the act of severing a part of ourselves and pretending it does not exist. The emotion is still there. The impulse is still alive. But the conscious mind has turned away from it, and in doing so, has handed it over to the unconscious. Now, the unconscious is not a passive receptacle. It is not a basement where unwanted things gather dust. It is a living, dynamic system with its own intelligence, its own purposes. What we repress does not remain static. It transforms. It becomes something else. And because it has been exiled from consciousness, it no longer speaks the language of reason. It speaks in symptoms, in compulsions, in accidents that are not accidents, in behaviors that seem to work against our own interests but serve a hidden purpose we refuse to see. The ego constructs its identity carefully. It selects what it wishes to be and discards what does not fit. I am this, but I'm not that. I am rational, not emotional. I am strong, not weak. I am kind, not angry. These identifications are necessary for functioning in the world, but they come at a cost. Everything that does not align with the ego's image of itself must be suppressed. And this rejected material does not vanish. It accumulates in what we might call the shadow. The shadow is not evil, though it often contains what we judge as bad. It is simply everything we are that we refuse to admit. It holds the emotions we were taught were unacceptable, the rage we learned to smile through, the grief we were told to move past, the desire we were taught to be ashamed of, the weakness we could not afford to show. All of this lives on in the shadow, and because it is unconscious, it acts autonomously. It has its own will. And when the ego denies it too long, it begins to assert itself through interference. Consider the man who prides himself on being in control. He has built his life around order, discipline, and rationality. He does not acknowledge fear. He does not acknowledge vulnerability. These things threaten his identity, so he suppresses them. But the fear does not leave. It descends into the unconscious, and there it grows more powerful. It begins to express itself indirectly. He becomes rigid. He micromanages. He develops inexplicable anxiety before important events. He finds himself procrastinating on tasks that would advance his career, not because he lacks ability, but because the unconscious fear of exposure or failure has commandeered his behavior. He sabotages himself precisely at the moments that matter most, and he does not understand why, because he refuses to see the fear he has denied. Or consider the woman who has learned that to be loved, she must always be pleasing. She cannot say no. She cannot express anger. She has suppressed her own boundaries so thoroughly that she no longer knows where she ends and others begin. And yet, the anger does not disappear. It festers. And because it cannot be expressed directly, it comes out sideways. She agrees to commitments she resents. She becomes passive-aggressive. She grows exhausted and resentful, but cannot name the source. Eventually, she collapses under the weight of obligations she never wanted, and she blames herself for being weak, never recognizing that the real weakness was in her refusal to honor her own anger when it first arose. This is the paradox of suppression. We suppress in order to protect ourselves, but the suppression itself becomes the danger. The emotion we refuse to feel does not lose its power, it gains power, and it will find a way to be heard, even if that means destroying what the ego has built. Now, why does the psyche operate this way? Why does it not simply let us ignore what we do not wish to face? Because the psyche seeks wholeness, not comfort. It seeks integration, not division. When we suppress a part of ourselves, we create a split. We are no longer whole. We are at war with ourselves, and the unconscious will continue to push the rejected material back into consciousness until it is acknowledged. This is not punishment. It is an attempt at healing. The sabotage is not an attack. It is a message. The unconscious speaks in symbols, in dreams, in slips of the tongue, in impulses that seem irrational. When these messages are ignored, the volume increases. The symptoms become more severe. What begins as a vague unease becomes chronic anxiety. What begins as mild procrastination becomes paralysis. What begins as occasional forgetfulness becomes a pattern of self-destruction. The psyche escalates until we are forced to pay attention. Self-sabotage, then, is the shadow's way of saying, "You have denied me long enough. You will acknowledge me now, or I will make it impossible for you to continue as you are." This brings us to the mechanism of projection. When we cannot face what is within us, we often see it in others. The man who suppresses his own aggression becomes convinced that the world is full of hostile people. The woman who suppresses her own ambition resents those who pursue success openly. We project onto the external world what we refuse to own internally, and this projection blinds us. We react to others as though they are the problem, never realizing that we are reacting to ourselves. But projection alone is not enough to contain the shadow indefinitely. Eventually, the suppressed emotion must find direct expression, and if we will not give it conscious expression, it will take control unconsciously. This is where self-sabotage becomes inevitable. The sabotage is the shadow, acting out what the ego refuses to enact. It is the unconscious doing what the conscious mind forbids. Let us take the example of grief. A man loses someone he loves, but he does not allow himself to grieve. He tells himself he must be strong. He tells himself there is no time for sadness. He buries the pain and continues with his life. But grief does not obey dismissal. It remains in the body, in the psyche, and because it is not processed, it begins to shape his behavior in hidden ways. He becomes numb. He withdraws from relationships. He loses interest in things that once mattered to him. And then, when an opportunity arises for new connection or new joy, he finds himself inexplicably pulling away. He sabotages the possibility of happiness, not because he does not want it, but because the unresolved grief has claimed sovereignty over his emotional life. The sabotage is the grief's way of ensuring it is finally felt. Or consider shame. Shame is perhaps the most toxic of suppressed emotions because it attacks the very core of identity. When we carry unacknowledged shame, we do not believe we deserve success, love, or happiness. And so, when these things come within reach, the shame rises up and destroys them. We make choices that confirm our unworthiness. We push away those who care for us. We fail at tasks we are capable of completing. The sabotage is not random. It is the enactment of an inner verdict. I am not worthy of this. And until that shame is brought into the light and examined, it will continue to dictate our fate. This is why self-knowledge is not optional for a meaningful life. It is not a luxury. It is a necessity. We must come to know what we have suppressed, or we will be ruled by it. We must integrate the shadow, or it will integrate us, but on its own terms, which are never gentle. Integration does not mean giving free rein to every impulse. It does not mean acting out every suppressed emotion. It means acknowledging what is there. It means bringing the unconscious into consciousness so that it can be understood, felt, and eventually transformed. The emotion that is seen loses its compulsive power. The shadow that is recognized can be negotiated with, but what remains hidden controls us absolutely. This process is what we might call individuation. It is the journey toward becoming whole, toward reconciling the conscious and unconscious aspects of the self. It is painful work. It requires us to face what we have spent years avoiding. It requires us to admit our weaknesses, our fears, our hidden desires. It requires us to see ourselves not as we wish to be, but as we are. And most people would rather sabotage themselves 1,000 times than undergo this honest confrontation. But there is no way around it. The suppressed will return. The shadow will speak. The only question is whether we will listen before the damage becomes irreparable. Now, let us speak of trauma, because trauma is often the origin of suppression. When something overwhelming happens, especially in childhood, the psyche does not have the capacity to process it fully. The emotion is too large, too painful, too threatening, and so it is split off. It is suppressed not as a choice, but as a survival mechanism. The child who is abandoned learns to suppress the terror of abandonment. The child who is shamed learns to suppress the feeling of worthlessness. These suppressions are necessary at the time. They allow the child to continue functioning. But they do not resolve the emotion. They only postpone it. And years later, the adult finds themselves sabotaging relationships when intimacy grows too close. Because intimacy activates the old terror of abandonment, the adult finds themselves undermining their own success, because success activates the old shame of unworthiness. The sabotage is the reactivation of the trauma that was never processed. It is the past asserting itself in the present, demanding resolution. Healing, then, is not about positive thinking or willpower. It is about returning to the suppressed emotion and finally allowing it to be felt. It is about creating the safety and capacity that were not available at the time of the original wounding. This is difficult work. It often requires support, whether through analysis, therapy, or deep introspection, but it is the only way to stop the cycle of self-sabotage. The emotion must be felt, acknowledged, and integrated, or it will continue to dictate behavior from the shadows. We must also speak of the role of the archetypes in this process. The archetypes are the inherited patterns of the collective unconscious, the universal structures that shape human experience. When we suppress our personal emotions, we often activate archetypal energies unconsciously. The suppressed anger may constellate the archetype of the destroyer. The suppressed grief may activate the archetype of the mourner. These archetypal forces are far more powerful than personal emotions. They carry the weight of countless generations, and when they are activated unconsciously, they can take over the personality entirely. The person who suppresses their anger may suddenly find themselves in a rage that seems disproportionate to the situation. This is not merely personal anger. It is archetypal rage, the fury of the oppressed, the wrath of the denied. The person who suppresses their need for nurturing may find themselves in relationships where they are endlessly caretaking others while never receiving care themselves. This is the archetype of the martyr, activated because the personal need was never honored. Self-sabotage, in these cases, is the archetype asserting its pattern. It is the psyche trying to restore balance, but because it is happening unconsciously, the restoration takes a destructive form. The only way to prevent this is to consciously engage with the archetypal energy, to recognize it, to give it appropriate expression. This requires symbolic work, ritual, creative expression, or deep psychological exploration. The archetypes operate according to their own logic. They do not care about our personal plans or ambitions. They care about the completion of their patterns. And if we are unconscious of them, they will complete their patterns through us, whether we consent or not. The woman who has suppressed her need for independence may find herself in a series of relationships with domineering partners, not because she consciously chooses such men, but because the archetype of the captive seeks its liberation through experience. The sabotage of each relationship is not failure. It is the archetype pushing toward its resolution. But this resolution will be painful and destructive as long as it remains unconscious. Only when she recognizes the pattern, when she sees the archetype at work, can can she begin to engage with it consciously and find a less destructive path to freedom? And what of responsibility? We must speak plainly here. 2. Understand that suppressed emotions return as self-sabotage is to accept responsibility for our own lives. We cannot continue to blame circumstances, other people, or fate for patterns that originate within us. This is not about guilt. It is about power. As long as we believe we are victims of external forces, we remain powerless. But when we recognize that the sabotage comes from within, we reclaim the possibility of change. We are no longer at the mercy of invisible forces. We can bring them into the light, we can work with them, we can transform them. This is the meaning of consciousness. It is the ability to see what is rather than what we wish were. It is the willingness to face our own darkness, not with judgment, but with curiosity and compassion. The shadow is not our enemy. It is the part of us that has been waiting to be seen. And when we finally turn toward it, when we finally acknowledge the suppressed emotions that have been driving our behavior, something extraordinary happens. The energy that was locked in conflict becomes available for life. The sabotage ceases, not because we have overcome it through force, but because it no longer has a purpose. The message has been received. So if you find yourself repeatedly sabotaging your own efforts, ask yourself, what am I refusing to feel? What emotion have I deemed unacceptable? What part of myself have I exiled? The answer will not come immediately. It may take time. It may require you to sit with discomfort, to explore memories you have avoided, to feel what you have spent years trying not to feel. But the answer is there. And when you find it, you will understand why the sabotage was necessary. You will see that it was not an enemy, but a guide, pointing you toward the very thing you needed to integrate. Let me give you another example to deepen this understanding. Consider the young man who grows up in a household where emotional expression is forbidden. His father is stern and distant. His mother is anxious and controlled. Any display of emotion is met with punishment or mockery. The boy learns quickly that to survive, he must suppress his feelings. He learns to present a composed exterior. He learns to rationalize everything, to live entirely in his head. And this strategy works for him. He succeeds in school. He builds a career. He appears to function well in the world. But then he enters into an intimate relationship and something begins to break down. His partner wants emotional connection. She wants him to share his feelings, to be vulnerable, to express what is happening inside him, and he cannot do it. He tries, but the words will not come. The feelings are locked away so deeply that he can no longer access them. And so he begins to sabotage the relationship in subtle ways. He withdraws. He becomes critical. He picks fights over trivial matters. He creates distance, not because he does not love her, but because intimacy threatens to open the vault where all his suppressed emotions are stored. The sabotage protects him from having to feel what he has spent a lifetime avoiding. But in protecting him, it also destroys the very connection he desires. This is the tragedy of suppression. It begins as protection and ends as prison. The walls we build to keep pain out eventually keep life out as well. And the only way to break free is to tear down those walls, to allow ourselves to feel what we have refused to feel, to grieve what we have refused to grieve, to rage where we have refused to rage. This is terrifying work. It feels like death. In a sense, it is death. It is the death of the false self, the constructed identity that was built on suppression. But it is also birth. It is the emergence of the true self, the whole self, the self that includes both light and shadow, both strength and vulnerability, both joy and sorrow. The process of integration is not linear. It does not happen all at once. There will be moments of insight, followed by periods of resistance. There will be progress, followed by regression. The unconscious does not give up its contents easily. It tests our resolve. It throws up defenses. It creates new symptoms when the old ones are resolved. This is why the work requires patience and persistence. It is not a matter of a single realization or a single cathartic experience. It is a lifelong process of becoming acquainted with oneself, of learning to recognize the patterns, of catching the sabotage before it takes hold. And it is here that we must speak of the ego's defenses, because the ego does not surrender willingly. It has invested enormous energy in maintaining its version of reality, its version of who we are. And when that version is threatened, the ego fights back. It uses rationalization to explain away the sabotage. It uses denial to avoid seeing the pattern. It uses intellectualization to keep the emotions at a safe distance. It uses humor to deflect serious examination. It uses busyness to avoid introspection. All of these are defense mechanisms, and they serve a purpose. They protect the ego from being overwhelmed. But they also prevent growth. They keep us stuck in the same patterns, repeating the same self-sabotage, wondering why nothing ever changes. To break through these defenses requires a kind of ruthless honesty with oneself. It requires the willingness to question everything we believe about who we are. It requires the courage to admit that we might be wrong about ourselves, that the story we have been telling might be incomplete or false. This is why so few people undertake this work voluntarily. Most people only turn toward the unconscious when life forces them to, when the sabotage has become so destructive that they can no longer ignore it, when they have lost everything they thought mattered and have no choice but to look within. But it does not have to reach that point. We can choose to examine ourselves before the crisis comes. We can choose to pay attention to the small acts of sabotage, the subtle ways we undermine ourselves, the quiet patterns that repeat across our lives. We can choose to ask, what is this trying to tell me? What am I avoiding? What have I suppressed that is now demanding to be seen? And when we ask these questions sincerely, when we truly listen for the answer, the unconscious responds. It may respond through a dream that reveals a forgotten memory. It may respond through a sudden insight that connects seemingly unrelated events. It may respond through a symptom that finally makes sense. The unconscious is always trying to communicate with us. The problem is that we have stopped listening. We have become so identified with the conscious ego, so invested in our constructed identity, that we have lost touch with the deeper layers of ourselves. Reconnecting with those deeper layers is the essence of psychological work. It is not about becoming someone new. It is about remembering who we have always been beneath the suppression, beneath the defenses, beneath the false self that we constructed to survive. It is about reclaiming the parts of ourselves that we abandoned long ago because we believed they were unacceptable. And it is about discovering that those parts, those suppressed emotions, those shadow elements are not our enemies. They are parts of us that have been waiting patiently, sometimes impatiently, to be integrated into the whole. Now, there is another dimension to this that must be addressed, and that is the dimension of the body. Suppressed emotions do not live only in the mind, they live in the body as well. The body holds the memory of every experience, every trauma, every suppressed feeling. And when we refuse to feel our emotions consciously, they express themselves through the body. They become tension in the shoulders. They become pain in the back. They become digestive problems. They become chronic fatigue. They become illness. The body does not lie. It cannot be fooled by the ego's rationalizations. And so the body becomes another avenue through which the unconscious speaks. Self-sabotage, then, can take the form of physical symptoms that prevent us from pursuing our goals. The man who is terrified of success develops a mysterious illness just before an important presentation. The woman who is afraid of intimacy develops chronic pain that prevents her from being physically close to her partner. These are not imagined symptoms. They are real. But their origin is not purely physical. They are the body's way of expressing what the mind refuses to acknowledge. Healing these symptoms requires more than physical treatment. It requires addressing the underlying emotional suppression. It requires listening to what the body is trying to say. This is why purely medical approaches often fail with chronic conditions. They treat the symptom but ignore the message. And so the symptom persists, or it shifts to another part of the body because the underlying emotional cause has not been addressed. This is not to say that all physical illness is psychological in origin. But there is often a psychological component, especially in chronic conditions that resist conventional treatment. And exploring that psychological component can open pathways to healing that would otherwise remain closed. As we near the end of this reflection, let me return to the central question. Why do suppressed emotions return as self-sabotage? Because the psyche will not be divided against itself indefinitely. Because wholeness is the natural state of the psyche, and anything that fragments that wholeness will eventually be corrected, one way or another. The suppression creates a split, and the unconscious works tirelessly to heal that split. If we will not heal it consciously through awareness and integration, then it will be healed unconsciously through symptoms, through sabotage, through suffering. But it will be healed. The only question is how much damage we will sustain in the process. The invitation, then, is to choose the conscious path, to choose to examine what we have suppressed, to choose to feel what we have refused to feel, to choose to integrate what we have denied. This is not easy work, it is not comfortable work, but it is liberating work. It frees us from the tyranny of the unconscious. It frees us from the endless cycle of self-sabotage. It allows us to live our lives with intention and awareness, rather than being driven by forces we do not understand. If this exploration has resonated with something in you, if it has touched upon patterns you recognize in your own life, I invite you to support this channel by pressing the like button and subscribing to Psyche and Meaning. This work exists because there are people who value depth over distraction, who are willing to look honestly at themselves, who understand that the path to meaning runs through the darkness of the unconscious. Your engagement helps this content reach others who are ready for this kind of reflection. And so we return to where we began. The man or woman standing at the threshold of success, inexplicably pulling back, destroying what they have worked to build. They are not cursed. They are not weak. They are not fundamentally flawed. They are simply living out the logic of the suppressed. They are enacting a drama written in the unconscious, a drama whose script was formed long ago in moments of pain and protection. But the drama is not fixed. It can be rewritten. The script can be changed, but only if we are willing to see it, to understand it, to take responsibility for it. The suppressed will always return. This is the nature of the psyche. But whether it returns as sabotage or as wisdom, whether it destroys us or transforms us, depends entirely on our willingness to meet it consciously. The choice, as it always has been, is ours to make. And the time to make that choice is now, before the next act of sabotage, before the next opportunity is destroyed, before we lose one more thing we did not mean to lose. The work awaits. The unconscious is patient. It will give us as many chances as we need. But each chance carries a cost. And eventually, if we continue to refuse the call, the cost becomes too great. So turn inward. Listen, feel, acknowledge, integrate. This is the path. This is the work. This is how we stop sabotaging ourselves and begin, finally, to live.